Hello viewers, welcome to the section Building Microservices with Spring Boot. In this section we will learn about Spring Boot Hello World, running our Hello World application, building REST service, simple REST method returning an object, creating a to-do resource, and adding a to-do. Now we move on to the video Spring Boot Hello World. In this video we will start with building our first Spring Boot application. Also, we will use Maven to manage dependencies. Before going to build Spring Boot application, we need to follow a few steps that are involved in starting up with a Spring Boot application. Configure Spring Boot starter parent in your pom.xml file. Configure the pom.xml file with the required starter projects. Configure spring-boot-maven-plugin to be able to run the application. Create your first Spring Boot launch class. Let's start with step 1, configuring the starter projects. Open the Eclipse IDE and import the existing Maven project which is provided in the code bundle. So in our case, select root folder as tests section 2 in C drive. First we will configure Spring Boot starter parent. Let's start with a simple pom.xml file with Spring Boot starter parent. The first question is this: why do we need Spring Boot starter parent? A Spring Boot starter parent dependency contains the default versions of Java to use, the default versions of dependencies that Spring Boot uses, and the default configuration of the Maven plugins. The Spring Boot starter parent dependency inherits from Spring Boot dependencies, which is defined at the top of the POM. The highlighted code shows an extract from Spring Boot starter parent. The Spring Boot dependencies provide default dependency management for all the dependencies that Spring Boot uses. The dependencies block of code shows the different versions of various dependencies that are configured in Spring Boot dependencies. If we want to override a specific version of a dependency, we can do that by providing a property with the right name in the pom.xml file of our application. The highlighted code shows an example of configuring our application to use version 1.8 of Java. Compatibility between different versions of frameworks is one of the major problems faced by developers. How do I find the latest Spring Session version that is compatible with a specific version of Spring? The usual answer would be to read the documentation. However, if we use Spring Boot, this is made simple by Spring Boot starter parent, which is defined in this highlighted block of code. If we want to upgrade to a newer Spring version, all that we need to do is to find the Spring Boot starter parent dependency for that Spring version. Once we upgrade our application to use that specific version of Spring Boot starter parent, we would have all the other dependencies upgraded to the versions compatible with the new Spring version. One less problem for developers to handle. Next, we will configure pom.xml with the required starter project. Whenever we want to build an application in Spring Boot, we would need to start looking for starter projects. Let's focus on understanding what a starter project is. Starters are simplified dependency descriptors customized for different purposes. For example, Spring Boot Starter Web is the starter for building a web application, including RESTful, using Spring MVC. It uses Tomcat as the default embedded container. If I want to develop a web application using Spring MVC, all we would need to do is include Spring Boot Starter Web in our dependencies, which is highlighted. For the web application we would like to build, we would also want to do some good unit testing and deploy it on Tomcat. The highlighted dependencies block of code shows the different starter dependencies that we would need. We would need to add this to our pom.xml file. We have added 3 starter projects. We've already discussed Spring Boot Starter Web. It provides us with the frameworks needed to build a web application with Spring MVC. The Spring Boot Starter Test dependency provides a few test frameworks needed for unit testing. First is JUnit, which is the basic unit test framework. Second is Mockito for mocking. Next, Hamcrest and AssertJ for readable asserts. Finally, Spring Test, which is a unit testing framework for Spring context-based applications. The Spring Boot Starter Tomcat dependency is the default for running web applications. We include it for clarity. Spring Boot Starter Tomcat is the starter for using Tomcat as the embedded servlet container. We now have our pom.xml file configured with the starter parent and the required starter projects. We have added spring-boot-maven-plugin, which would enable us to run Spring Boot applications by using the build block of code. Further, we will configure spring-boot-maven-plugin. The spring-boot-maven-plugin dependency provides capabilities for both of the previous situations. The highlighted build block of code shows how we can configure spring-boot-maven-plugin in an application. The spring-boot-maven-plugin dependency provides several goals for a Spring Boot application. The most popular goal is run this can be executed as maven spring-boot:"run on the command prompt from the root folder of the project. Next, we will create your first Spring Boot launch class. Open the application.java file. The class explains how to create a simple Spring Boot launch class. It uses the static run method from the Spring application class, which is highlighted. The highlighted block of code is a simple Java main method executing the static run method on the Spring application class. The Spring application class can be used to bootstrap and launch a Spring application from a Java main method. There are a few steps that are typically performed when a Spring Boot application is bootstrapped. First, create an instance of Spring's application context. We have already created the application context, which is highlighted. Further, we will move on to the Spring Boot application. Annotation is a shortcut for 3 annotations. They are configuration, enable auto-configuration, component scan. Configuration indicates that this is a Spring application context configuration file. Enable auto-configuration, an important feature of Spring Boot. Component scan enables scanning for Spring beans in the package of this class and all its sub-packages. In this video, we built our first Spring Boot application. In the next video, we will learn to run our Hello World application.